J.P. Morgan, the man who owned America. Wealth, power, and influence. J.P. Morgan had it all. He owned the first billion-dollar company. He dominated the country's most profitable industries, and on multiple occasions, the economy of the United States quite literally depended on the actions of J.P. Morgan. With a simple word or the stroke of a man, he could save a company from collapse when committed to bankruptcy, aided by some admired others. There will never be another man quite like J.P. Morgan. This is his story. A man always has two reasons for doing anything: a good reason and a real reason. J.P. Morgan. Chapter 1: A Fragile Start. John Piper Morgan was born in Connecticut in 1837. It's a privileged circumstances. John's father, Junior Spencer Morgan, was already a wealthy banker, and he ensured that John had the best education the money could buy, since he wanted John to follow in his footsteps as a financier. However, despite being born into wealth, John's childhood was bleak. He was a sickly child. He regularly suffered from brutal coughing, wets, migraines, seizures, and various diseases such as scarlet fever. His medical conditions play outside with other kids. Instead, you find an inside studying or reading financial statements. In fact, at one point, John became incapacitated by rheumatic fever, and his father's solution was to send John to live by himself in the Azore Islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. His dad believed the climate and salty air would help John recover from his condition. So John stayed on the island for nearly a year without any family, and when he was finally well enough, he continued his education. By 1857, John had studied in Boston, Switzerland, and Germany, was now ready to enter the workforce. At this point, John's father was a junior partner at a London-based merchant banking firm called George Peabody and Co. And thanks to his father, John was able to get a job on Wall Street in the banking firm which looked after Peabody's interest in America. Part of John's job involved writing reports to his father's firm detailing the financial and political goings on in America, which of course at the time was still an emerging market. However, from an early age, John's father theatered that his son was too rational-tempered to ever become a successful financier, and its new restricted responsibility. One example of this was in 1859, while on a trip to New Orleans, joined me to see mainly reckless gamble by using company money to purchase an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee that arrived imports without a buyer. Even though John soldiered and made a tidy profit, the senior members of the banking house, including John and fathers, couldn't stand this kind of risk taking. So in 1861, age 24, John left the safety and security of established firm in order to strike out on his own funding. His own company would continue to act as an agent for. However, Amelia soon came down with a persistent cough that was later diagnosed as tuberculosis. So right after their wedding, John took her on an extended honeymoon in the Mediterranean, hoped that the new climate might restore her strength just like John's father had tried for him when he was younger. It was no use. John's wife died just 4 months after their wedding, leaving John a widower at 24. He was an inconsolable mess, and it's believed he never truly recovered from this tragic loss of his wife at such a young age. Immediately after losing herself deep into his work more than ever, however, John was going through his own crisis. So, with the United States around this time of the American Civil War had broken out and affected 1863 Conscription Act should have been John went off the fight, but he didn't. Instead, John paid $300 to be removed from enlisting and had a substitute stand in his place. That's not to say John didn't get involved in the war bow. In fact, on the contrary, he profited from it hugely. One of the most notable examples was when he financed the purchase of 5,000 servers or carbine rifles at $3.5 each from the government that were considered too old to use. But then the consortium who bought them made some minor adjustment and almost immediately sold the same rifles back to the government for $22 each. It was an over 600% increase in price, and thus lost it was a very lucrative deal for John to be involved in this war. Profiteering was certainly not popular with the public office. That was least of his worries. John would soon be facing some much bigger controversies. Chapter 2: The Railroad Magnate. In 1871, John saw the golden opportunity to team up with one of the leading financiers in the country, a banker named Anthony Drexel. Together, they founded the Drexel Morgan & Co. private merchant banking house, which was later renamed to simply J.P. Morgan & Co. And this would be the firm that John would manage for the rest of his life, serving as the precursor to the modern banking titan we know today as J.P. Morgan Chase. Now, early John's career connecting wealthy investors and visionaries together in exchange for cover profits. But astronomers are bigger personal fortune of reputation. He was able to finance many of these projects on his own, and the return had already identified his first major investment, the American railroad system. Now, at the time, most of the other big industries were dominated by one single magnate. Like Carnegie dominated in steel, Rockefeller dominated in oil, the railroads weren't obliged. Actually, it was the opposite. There were so many competing companies that offered very similar routes, but they often slashed their prices to try and win customers. But whereas most look at the railroad business and saw fierce competition, John saw opportunity. He felt the answer was consolidation, moving railroads together rather complete today. Let's begin to John knew that the bigger business got, the more can benefit from economies of scale. So John's goal was always to turn multiple small companies into one unified conglomerate. Suddenly, rather than competing against each other and driving prices, they could set whatever prices they want as they owned all the nearby railroads. So John invested heavily in multiple railroads, which he began consolidating. He'd take over under-financed railroad companies, streamline their management and operational efficiency, and move the small companies together into one dominant player to crush any remaining competitors, which of course he'd then be able to take over as well. John used this tactic to such great effect, but it was even named after him, becoming known as an organization. But the other thing John did differently to other businessmen and investors of time was very productive role in the corporate management of these companies. John wasn't content with simply buying shares that sit back and breaking in the profit. He was a man who craved control. John needed to be the one calling the shots, so we regularly used his influential position on the boards of directors to direct the company as he saw fit. He often reshuffled the leadership of all these different railway companies, that is, liking and assembling them into monopolies with himself at the head of the table. Of course, when railroads came to him for help, he refused, unless he was given full control. This is not only gave John the power he wanted, but also created a more stable industry, which in turn attracted even more investments. Money from Europe flowed into US railway companies now that it looked for consolidated and stable things to John, and his of course made John even wealthier. John kept acquiring more rail lines and constantly wanted to outdo his previous achievements and be more ambitious. For example, he purchased 50,000 stocks William Vanderbilt, one of the most prominent railways in the country, the New York Central Railroads. He then took things even further the following year when he executed the largest transaction in Belvoir bonds ever made in the United States, underwriting the sale of $40 million in bonds to finance the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Before long, John owned 1/3 of all railroads in America at a time where 60% of America's stock market capitalization consisted of railroad companies. In other words, John was no longer just a wealthy financer. He was literally shaped. Walmarts are being heavily involved in reorganizations and mergers, all of which grew its power, welfare, and his growing reputation as a formidable titan of industry was matched by his intimidating appearance. John had a skin condition called rosacea that inflamed and ruptured the blood vessels of his nose, making it very red and disfigured, whilst he also had rhino fiber, which made his nose much larger and covered in pimples. John was actually very self-conscious about his parent and got angry at being photographed. According to his grandson, whenever John had a portrait done, he always redo his nose. We can look more normal, which is why it's not as noticeable in pictures of him, but his startling facial features combined with his towering height and his aggressive way of speaking all remember John was an intimidating presence to be around. However, in 1901, he seen John had finally met someone who would stand out to him. President Theodore Roosevelt consolidated his Northern Pacific Railroad together with two other railways in the region and created a massive new holding company, Open Northern Security Corporation, and he'd been able to get away with these kind of monopolistic practices due to his close relationship with from President William McKinley. But then McKinley was assassinated and suddenly Theodore Roosevelt became president, looking very different view on what John was doing. Roosevelt ordered the Justice Department to fight a suit against the company for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Was John fought this in court? The company was ultimately sped up, and this was just the beginning of a very tense relationship between the two men. When John Hood Roosevelt was going to Africa one year, John said, "Good, I hope the first lion that meets him does his duty." For John, though, this was mere order the Justice Department to fight a suit against the company violating Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Was John fought this in court? The company was ultimately set up, and this was just the beginning of a very tense relationship between the two men. Chapter 3: Man of Steel. In 1901, Carnegie Steel was its peak It dominated the steel industry and was one of the most valuable companies in the country. But despite netting 40 million a year, Carnegie was ready to retire and wanted to sell his company. But who could buy it? That's where John came in. He basically told Carnegie to name his price, and $48 million, which would be more than any other business deal in history. And yet John agreed on the spot and later confessed he would have paid 100 million more. John made the landmark purchase in 1901, but it was just the beginning of his ambitious plan. He merged Carnegie's deal with the Federal Steel Company and a few other businesses to form US Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, which had a market cap of $1.4 billion, just about that. In perspective, all the manufacturing in the country was capitalized at a combined $9 billion. This deal gave John control over two-thirds of the American steel production, so basically two of the largest industries of the time were steel and railroads, and John had seemingly conquered both, and he didn't stop there. John helped finance Thomas Edison's early experiments with electricity. He then played an important role in merging Edison Electric with its competitors in order to create General Electric. And his job is also influential in creating that would later become AT&T. That's for combining companies together and turning them into unstoppable giants was unmatched. But unfortunately, the crisis was about to begin. Chapter 4: Crisis. In 1893, the United States was facing an impression for likes of which had never seen before. After several decades of continued growth and unchecked investments, the bubble burst and the American economy was plugged into chaos, stopped, plummeted, losing almost half their value. Thousands of businesses closed their doors forever, hundreds of banks were bankrupt, and unemployment rate skyrocketed throughout the country. The grace is scarred off foreign investors who cashed in their American bonds in exchange of sunny, but surely depleting the US reserves, since over time the dollar was still tied to the gold standard, meaning anyone could convert their paper money into physical gold, and this had more confidence than paper money was actually worth something as a result. The American government always kept at least $100 million worth of gold, billion on hand in 95, most gone, and the dollar values was in sharp decline at its lowest. The government had no more than $9 million worth of gold reserves, which meant that it was in danger of defaulting on its own loans at any moment. Was a final goal just spread more panic, having the domino effect when more investors pulled that money out of the US and depleted the reserves even further. The US didn't have a central bank at the time to rescue them, and that the situation was extremely dire. President Cleveland understood that this was a crossroads moment for America that would forever alter its course. The traditional strategy of simply selling more bonds to the American people wouldn't work fast enough. John knew this was the time for drastic and immediate action, so he traveled to Washington to meet the president, lay out his game plan in order to bring America back from the brink of an economic disaster. John Dodge's scheme was the fully privacy syndicate consisting of the most prominent bankers in the country who had worked together with foreign investors to shore up America's gold reserves. A syndicate of to purchase $65 million worth of 30-year-old bonds using 3.5 billion ounces of gold. Thanks to an old Civil War statute, President Cleveland could agree to the deal right then and there without having to wait for approval from Congress. Once Cleveland signed, John White has met in New York and told him to act, and in only 22 minutes they bought out all the gold bonds. John's decisive actions had an immediate calming effect on the volatile financial markets restored faith in the economy. John Adore single-handedly saved them from total collapse, and of course being the shrewd businessman that he was, it also made a large profit from the enterprise by securing generous rates on the gold bonds that he purchased, and that's what John had saved the day and helped bail out the government. It also raised concern. It illustrated the vast influence of power of one single banker on the entire US economy, and some asked whether his motivations were really patriotic or simply opportunistic to line his own pockets at the next election. The relationship between big banks and the government was a hot topic for the Democrats, but John and his banker friends donated heavily to the Republican nominee who won the election instead. So for now, John kept his close ties off the government, but was not the only time that John was instrumental in stabilizing the American economy. When stabilizing the American economy in 1907, the country was facing another deepening financial crisis, which had to several banks being on the verge of bankruptcy, leading to hordes of people queuing up around the block to withdraw their money from their bank accounts. The government reportedly had to tell bank tellers to deliberately count the money slower to try and reduce the rate cash was being withdrawn, because if ever all the money out at the same time, it can be catastrophic. By this point, Roosevelt was the president, and as we already know, he certainly did not see eye to eye with John on most things. But the crisis of 1907 was so dire that they both agreed it would be in America's best interest if the government and big business worked together to save the country from falling into pressure. So Roosevelt called on J.P. Morgan to salvage the situation. Once again, John's strategy was to spend a lot of money where it was needed most. He summoned dozens of the leading finances and leaders of the nation's biggest banks and trusts to join him in his private library on Madison Ave Library, and decided on the best course of action. John's plan was essentially for them to invest in their similar competitors. John concluded that although some banks would inevitably fail, others could still be saved. So he and his associates deposited giant sums of money in a number of banks so that they would be able to pay their depositors and avoid declaring bankruptcy after revealing his plan. John then locked the door for the bankers, negotiated among themselves, literally locking them in until they agreed on a resolution. By the morning, everyone had agreed with John's plan and with Roosevelt's approval. The US Treasury also contributed $25 million, showing the level of trust and respect the president had for John's business sense. What's remarkable is the job of 70 years old at this point and negotiated all of this while having a terrible cold, meaning he was constantly coughing and sneezing while saving the US economy. But his plan ultimately worked. Not to capital was injected back into the economy. Public confidence was restored in America's banking system, and yet another economic disaster was averted thanks to John's willings and aliens. But whilst he was once again briefly labeled as a hero, almost immediately people began to realize just how dependent they had become on one single man. Chapter 5: Legacy. John was facing increased scrutiny. The age of the robber baron who could conduct his business unchecked and unimpeded or slowly coming to an end as the American public was growing increasingly wary of a handful of businessmen wielding so much power and influence. John was summoned to testify before the Pujo Committee. They wanted to investigate the true reach of Wall Street's money trust and its role in the American economy. John was front and center during the Paget Committee, and he became the face of Wall Street power despite his financial successes. John's mental state was deteriorating. He had multiple nervous breakdowns and he struggled to deal with the public's negative portrayal of him in the media. Ironically, he was actually due to board the Titanic for his maiden voyage, but due to health issues pulled out at the last moment. Meanwhile, the Peugeot Committee paved the way for the establishment of the Federal Reserve, since it was clear they couldn't just rely on a handful of ultra-rich and powerful individuals to step in and fix the economy. But John would never see the repercussion of this investigation, because months later, on March 31st, 1913, the 75-year-old financier died while on vacation in Bro. After his death, John's son took over the business and continued his expansion. In fact, even in present day, there is still concerns the bank is too powerful. It's undergone countless acquisitions and mergers over the years, something John himself would have been proud of, like mergers with Bank One Best Earns, and most notably of all, in the year 2000, the merge with Chase Bank to create JP Morgan Chase, with rated $3 trillion in assets after 200 years of consolidation in the banking industry. JP Morgan Chase is the biggest bank in the world by market capitalization, and so it was the Indian will be divided on John Pip on organ. There's no doubt his legacy lives on, but personally, when it comes to the era,